Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning breakout session on behalf of Berk and the Energy Symposium team. This breakout session is on carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration. Just a few logistical notes. If you have cell phones or pagers, I would kindly ask you to please turn them off right now. And we have an exit at the back, and we have two emergency exits through the outside doors, both going downstairs to the second or third floor. Just to give you a bit of background about myself, my name is Qayyum Mansour. I am a graduate student here in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and my research focus is on carbon sequestration. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-organizer, Naveen Sikka, whom most of you have had a chance to hear this morning. Naveen is currently a graduate student in the business school over here. So currently, if we look at fossil fuels account for about 85% of our global energy production. And its continued reliance on fossil energy is contributing to large amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. There are a lot of technologies that we're investigating to reduce CO2 emissions. So we're very fortunate to have a very distinguished panel over here to discuss the policy and technical implications, some of the economic challenges, and some of the policy issues regarding CO2 sequestration, and also some of the commercialization options to make it not only feasible, but hopefully to make it viable and practical. Let me begin by introducing our moderator. I have to make a quick note. Initially, if you look at your program notes, Jim Johnson from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory was supposed to moderate this panel, but unfortunately, due to family emergency, he can't be with us today. Kurt Oldenburg, sitting right here to my right, is a staff scientist. Kurt Oldenburg is a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which is one of the jewels in the DOE National Lab Complex located right up here on the hill, just east of here. Kurt's research work focuses on multi-phase flow, geochemical transport, flow and transport modeling, and just a variety of areas. But lately, for the last 8 years or so, Kurt has been focusing on geologic carbon sequestration, looking at enhanced gas recovery through geologic carbon sequestration, and also looking at long-term impacts of leakage and risks from geologic carbon sequestration sites. Kurt got his doctorate at University of California, Santa Barbara, and looking at Kurt, I'm trying to imagine him with long hair and a surfboard.
And a beard.
And a beard. Give it over to Kurt.
Okay, thanks very much, Qayyum. I'm both the moderator as well as one of the speakers, and in fact, the first speaker. So I'll begin my talk. We're going to try to keep our talks to 10 to 15 minutes at the very most, so there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. Qayyum, would you like us to take questions after each talk as well, or save them all? Okay. So I'll begin, and I'll introduce each of the other speakers before they talk. Yeah, let's have that. You got a slideshow.
Yeah, just click on your.
Okay, so I'm going to talk here about some of the challenges of geologic carbon sequestration. And as I've talked with audiences in the past, I've come to realize that a lot of people don't have a real good concept for just what the subsurface is like. There's a feeling that there are large open caverns and big open cavities down there that we can inject things into. In fact, that's generally not the case. What it is a rock with a lot of pore space, and some rocks without so much pore space. But invariably, these rocks already contain something, and usually that's water. But in other cases, it's oil and gas. So this figure from the IPCC special report on carbon capture and storage shows the concepts for geologic carbon sequestration. So the first option here in terms of where to put the stuff, where to put CO2, is depleted oil and gas reservoirs. and that's shown here by this well in an onshore situation. There could also be offshore situations, but what's happening there is that you're injecting CO2 into a reservoir that has previously or currently contained oil and gas, so it's a known trap. And in addition, typically these have been produced, and so there's actually some volume there available for the CO2 to go into. CO2 can also be used to enhance oil and gas recovery, and that's illustrated here in this number 2, where you inject CO2 and it both pushes oil out as well as dissolves into oil and makes it more mobile. So this is another option for geologic carbon dioxide storage. The largest volume is available in deep saline formations that don't have oil or gas, but they're ubiquitous in the deep subsurface. And so this is illustrated in 3B here, as well as, again, an offshore situation. So in that sort of configuration, you're injecting carbon dioxide and displacing the salt water that's there and pushing it into the formation where previously there had been no significant production of anything. And then the final one is this enhanced coal bed methane, which I won't discuss. So these are the scenarios for CO2 storage in the deep subsurface. The trapping mechanisms that are involved there, that is what holds the CO2 down, can be shown in this nice diagram, again from the IPCC report, special report, where we have the percentage of the trapping contribution by these various mechanisms over time. So in the beginning, when CO2 is first injected, it's typically trapped due to some barriers that it's encountering in the rock. So this is referred to as structural and stratigraphic trapping. Shales and other low permeability rocks will prevent the CO2 from migrating upwards. As time goes on and CO2 migrates and water moves in where CO2 was, we have a very significant process known as residual CO2 trapping, where the CO2 is stuck in small pores, and it really is trapped even though it's still free phase supercritical CO2. Also, as time goes on, we get a bigger proportion of solubility trapping. So this is what happens as CO2 dissolves into that brine, and in fact, it increases the density of the brine, so it makes us a little bit more space. And finally, at long, long times, much of the CO2 will react and produce solid mineral phases, and this is considered the most secure form of trapping, analogous to a limestone rock or something. It's very stable. And so as time goes on, we see a decreasing proportion of structural and stratigraphic, increasing proportions of residual CO2, increasing solubility, and increasing mineral trapping. So this is thought to demonstrate the security of CO2 storage as it goes on, but do note the time scales here. We're talking many, many years. That's a log scale there until we really have very secure CO2 trapping. Now, CO2 is a substance that's ubiquitous and essential to life. With every breath I'm taking, I'm concentrating it by about a factor of 100 in my exhaled breath. It's all around us. It's analogous to water in many ways in that sense. Clearly, we are emitting way too much of it through our fossil fuel combustion, but it's not inherently a poisonous substance. There's an analogy to trapping gases worldwide, and that is the oil and gas reservoirs that we have on Earth. So clearly the deep subsurface is capable of trapping these kinds of substances and preventing them from migrating up to the surface. Another industrial analog we have for CO2 storage is natural gas storage. This is done seasonally throughout the world, and shown here are a lot of natural gas storage sites in the United States. Depending on the climate, in winter and summer can have larger demands for power, and yet natural gas is produced at a much more steady rate from natural formations in Canada or wherever it's being piped from. And so we store it underground until it's needed, and then we produce more to generate electricity when it's needed. So this is a process that's been going on for many, many years, and there are a few cases where there have been some issues with natural gas storage, but generally it's considered a very safe and effective process. Many people, when we talk about CO2 storage, mention natural disasters such as that at Lake Nyos in Cameroon, where a volcanically sourced CO2 entered a lake and then was erupted out of that lake violently, and killed many people and a lot of livestock. And this sort of event is really not very relevant to CO2 storage. It takes a very particular kind of lake to produce an event like those. And the sites that are being investigated for CO2 storage really have no similarities to those sorts of environments. So CO2 storage is being done at industrial scale at least 3 places around the Earth. The oldest and most well-known is the Sleipner project in the North Sea of Norway. The CO2 in this case is coming from natural gas. So methane that's contaminated with CO2 naturally is produced. The CO2 is stripped out of the gas before they sell the gas in a pipeline. And that CO2 is injected in a shallower aquifer. So this is the saline target style, and CO2 has been injected there since 1996 at 1 million tons per year. This is sort of the most famous project worldwide. There's another large CO2 EOR project in Saskatchewan known as Weyburn, and this has been going on since about the year 2000. About 2.7 million tons per year of CO2 is injected. That CO2 is coming from a coal gasification plant in Beulah, North Dakota, and sent by pipeline. This project was, as I understand it, the economics were done with oil at about $25 a barrel. And so now with oil such a high price, they're making a lot of money on this and are extremely happy with this. The CO2 is injected. What is produced with the oil is recycled and re-injected, but they have a continuous need for CO2 because much of the CO2 never comes back up out of the ground. Finally, there's a large project in Algeria, and looks like I don't have a year on this, but it started in around 2005 or 2006, and it's similar to the Sleipner project where they have a natural gas that has too much CO2 in it to sell, so they strip the CO2 out and re-inject it. And in this case, they're re-injecting it into what's called the water leg of the gas reservoir. So it's not directly into the gas, but it's into a saline formation down dip from the gas cap. And this project is a little bit newer. It's also 1 million tons per year, but we're still waiting to see, for example, if CO2 does break through and get into the gas cap, et cetera. So these are 3 examples of this being done worldwide. This is a table, again, from the IPCC report showing I've discussed Weyburn and Sala and Sleipner. There are other projects that are going on. Then there's several pilot projects underway. The point of this is just to show that this is a process that's moving ahead and seems to be working, seems to be effective. Now, the challenge of this, the main one, I think you'll hear a refrain from this panel, is the scale of the problem. You have just enormous emissions. So, in this table, it's showing the number of sources, for example, from power plants worldwide, and then those emissions in 1 million tons of CO2 per year. What we have is a total of 13 or so gigatons of CO2 from all these stationary sources, and annual emissions worldwide are about 26 gigatons of CO2 per year. So about half of it are coming from point sources at which this process may be applicable. Collecting CO2 from mobile sources is not considered viable. It's point sources that are going to be viable for CO2 storage. So these numbers are huge, and often people don't really grasp just what they mean. So I like to bring them down to a more sort of understandable level. If you consider your own car, as you burn a gallon of gasoline, you're producing about 20 pounds of carbon dioxide for every gallon of gasoline that you burn. So if you're driving in a car that gets 20 miles per gallon and you're moving at 60 miles per hour, this is equivalent in terms of the carbon to throwing a charcoal briquette out the window about every 15 seconds or every quarter mile. So that kind of brings it down that we do have enormous CO2 emissions even from our transportation sector. And then if you look at the big picture in terms of power plants, a single 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant, which is about enough electricity for 1 million people or so, releases about 8 million tons of CO2 per year. So we have an enormous scale here. These CO2 emissions are accelerating worldwide. We heard this morning that it was 50 to 100 1 gigawatt coal-fired power plants are coming on every year. So this may be a little bit on the low side to say 1 every 10 days. So what's been done to, again, to get our hands around this issue and to understand the scale is to simplify some of these complex emissions predictions into very simple linear relationships. This was done by Pacala and Sokolow, so these are known as the wedges. I'm sure all of you have seen this. If you can sort of imagine not trying to solve this whole problem, but just one of these 7 wedges through geologic carbon sequestration, it seems like a much more tractable problem. So if we do that, and we acknowledge, again, as a challenge that supercritical CO2 is buoyant in these saline formations, it tends to want to rise up, and we realize that when it comes to the capacity, we have to look at injectivity, that is the properties right around the well where we're trying to inject it, how much pore space the CO2 actually occupies, how quickly it moves away versus displacing the water effectively, sort of stuff I won't get into here on again, how CO2 occupies the pores. If we just think about one wedge, we can use depleted oil and gas reservoirs alone worldwide to have about 150 years of capacity. So this one wedge isn't solving the entire CO2 emissions problem. We're going to rely on renewables and efficiency and some of the other things we'll hear about for the other 6 wedges. But if we can think about one wedge, I think that CO2 storage is a very viable process. Now we have challenges on the regulatory side. Frankly, there are just no regulations at this time nationwide for this. Various states are coming up with things, and the EPA is working hard right now to come up with a rule under its underground injection control program by July. A draft should be out next month in April on this, so they're working on this, but it doesn't exist yet. And where this challenge arises from, again, is the scale of the problem. So let's not look at very much on this figure in the interest of time, except for this Class 1H. This is in an existing EPA program called Underground Injection Control. There's a Class 1 hazardous injection well that currently in the United States permits the injection of 33 million cubic meters of water per year. This water is typically contaminated with all sorts of things. It's injected deep into these formations where it doesn't contaminate any underground source of drinking water. So this is currently permitted under Class 1H. If we look at what we'd have to do, injecting U.S. point source emissions, so at a rate of 3.4 billion cubic meters of CO2 per year to inject those, we would be injecting 100 times more by volume than is currently permitted under the Class 1H. So in terms of the significance down here in this table, we do a lot of injection in the United States of water deep underground, but in the case of the Class 1H well, we're going to have to inject over 100 times more than is currently permitted in that program. There's another water injection process that's used in the oil and gas industry, and there's actually a large amount of water injected, but typically this is re-injected water. So it's water that was produced, and then it's re-injected, typically into the same reservoir, so the volume already exists. So our challenge then with CO2 is that it's a new volume, and it's going to be more than 100 times what we're used to or what we currently permit. So the summary of these challenges here, again from the geologic perspective, is the scale of injection needed to have an impact on climate, the regulatory environment really hasn't been established. It just does not exist yet to allow this to go on. Although people are working on it, it's going to be years before this is really figured out nationally. There's bickering between states, as I'm sure you're aware of, due to all sorts of issues. But again, I think there'll be a long sort of spin-up time needed before there really are sound regulations in place. Liability I haven't touched on, but Dale Simbeck I think will touch on that enough. We have a lot of technical issues. As I said, it's going on worldwide, but this is largely a learning process. I think that the risks of a failure right now are not very big. Currently, we are emitting all of that CO2 in the atmosphere. And so risks of failure, of releases from the current projects, I think are not a big risk. Well, the advantage of doing these projects is that we're learning, we're seeing how these systems work, and so there's research going on following those projects and looking at all sorts of the issues of finding the right sites, how do we monitor those sites to see how they're performing, assessing risks, monitoring again, verifying where the CO2 is and how much is going in and that it's staying there, dealing with any unforeseen circumstances that may arise. And then the unknown things that we just can't predict right now. These pilot projects are allowing us to see that. So just to conclude, climate change is motivating CO2 emission reductions. We have large point sources of CO2 at which capture can be done. Dale will comment a lot on feasibility in terms of the economics of that. But the fact is that it can be done if people are willing to pay for it. We have geologic formations that exist in which CO2 can be stored. We understand processes and mechanisms of CO2 and its capture and permanence underground. We have capacity for hundreds of years of injection as long as we're not trying to do all of the wedges. In terms of the cost of this, we really should be comparing that to the cost of doing nothing, that is living with the global change that we're seeing today. I think that impacts of this process will be very limited in well-chosen sites, and I think CCS then is an effective way of reducing CO2 emissions in the very near future. Just as a reference, this is really still an excellent reference, just a few years old, the IPCC special report, and you can get it online and see just about everything about carbon dioxide capture and storage. Okay, thanks very much. So save your questions, and we'll move on next to the second talk. The speaker is Isha Ray. She's an assistant professor in the Energy and Resources group at UC Berkeley. She has a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University, and a PhD in applied economics from Stanford. She does research in the areas of water and development and technologies related to that. She's looked into problems of drinking water and irrigation management in India, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and Mexico. She's on the advisory board of many nonprofit groups, and today she'll be talking about public perception.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So now that my mini biography has been read out by Kurt, with CCS noticeably absent from it, naturally, any sane person in the audience is wondering what I'm doing here. So let me tell you right now, I'm an interloper. But you know what? You need some interlopers sometimes. I'm very interested in public perceptions of technology overall. And given that I'm in the Energy and Resources group, at some point I was bound to be hijacked out of water into an energy project, and this is it. So what I would like to share with you today are some very preliminary results on public perceptions of carbon capture and sequestration, by which I specifically mean geologic sequestration. We did not extend our work yet into terrestrial, in two communities where the Department of Energy has pilot projects, pilot injection projects going. So this work is based on research with Gabrielle Wong-Parodi, our graduate student, and Alex Farrell, my colleague at ERG. What did we ask? How did we inquire what public perceptions were? Before I...
something about unexpected consequences.
Is that far enough from the edge there, Kate?
Yeah, the table's okay.
Is it? Yeah. Just be careful when you're on the edge. Yeah.
A very rational decision, Kurt. Shall I continue? Okay, so let me continue. So, what did we ask in the two communities that we visited? Our main question was, in California's Central Valley, how do communities that are host sites or could become host sites of these pilot projects for geologic sequestration view the technology? And importantly, what might explain communities' willingness or resistance to being a CCS site? Let me step back for a minute and ask, why is this an important question? Is it an important question? This can be answered in multiple ways depending on where you stand. If, for example, you're interested in the democratization of policy, of public policy, of science, in the greater participation of the public in the implementation of science and technology policy, then it is obvious why this is an important question. How does the public feel? What might explain their resistance or willingness to having a large-scale, pretty large-scale infrastructure essentially in their backyard forever? But this is not the only reason to be interested. There is a more pragmatic reason to be interested as CCS becomes more and more important as climate mitigation technology, as a climate mitigation technology. For example, you could be least interested in the democratization of the participation of public policy. That could be like democracy, schmemocracy. I'm interested in this thing not turning into a damn yucca mountain. And this is a different reason for being interested. But there are multiple, therefore I just want to have you bear that in mind because you can come at this from different angles, but it's an important question politically as well as practically. What did we do? We went to two communities, which I'll describe in a moment, and we conducted focus groups. Because we were part of the West Carb project, which is already running, a pilot project, as I said, we were unable to conduct individual surveys with people. There is some federal stuff known as the Paperwork Reduction Act or whatever. So our primary desire, which was actually to conduct surveys one-on-one with members of these communities, was actually not allowed without going through even more paperwork, which seemed not reasonable in the context of having to reduce paperwork. So we didn't do it. We ultimately went for the focus group approach, which I just want to spend a minute on. A focus group is essentially a group interview. Instead of a one-on-one survey, you speak to 6, 8, 10 people who are interested in coming to talk to you. The great disadvantage, so you need to bear this in mind because I'm going to present my findings in 2 minutes. The great disadvantage of a focus group is that you're practically unable randomly to select from the population, which in a survey you can do. So you may have people coming to your focus groups who are especially interested in the topic. Okay? So you have to bear that in mind. Had we been able to conduct a random survey, we wouldn't have had this problem. Okay? But we weren't able to. The great advantage of a focus group approach is it actually helps you to see how different community members interact with each other and how the points they bring up then filter through the group, and then you see a kind of joint consensus formation through that interaction and negotiation, which in an individual survey, of course, you can never observe. So that is actually a plus point of the focus group approach, which I didn't appreciate until I really got into doing focus groups for a previous project. So we did 6 focus groups in these two communities. One community is Thornton, a pilot CCS site, actually a pilot CCS site. And the other community is Rio Vista, about 13 miles away from Thornton, which was potentially a CCS site. It's geologically similar. The reason it is not West Garb's CCS site is because there were approximately 900 landowners that had to be individually negotiated with in order to make the pilot go through, and that was a big pain with high transactions costs, whereas Thornton has only 3 landowners, and that was much more easy for West Garb to negotiate that, the agreement of the landowners to use their land. But geologically, it's very, very similar, and they were almost a pilot site. So we used them as a rough control. But you'll see in a minute why it wasn't a good control. And in addition, we did one-on-one interviews, not, you will be happy to know, involving the use of paper. Where did we go? Our first site was Thornton. This is Thornton's downtown. Can everybody see it? This is Thornton's downtown. It has about 1,500 documented residents. We do not know how many undocumented residents there are. Rough guesses we got was approximately 12% additional, but we have no proof. The median income in Thornton is about $27,000, so it is a low-income community, largely Hispanic and white. This is Rio Vista, the site that was not chosen. This is Rio Vista's downtown. Definitely a classier-looking place. The median income of Rio Vista is about $53,000, so it's considerably better off than Thornton, the actual site chosen. Okay? Now, I will briefly present our findings. There were some common concerns raised by both the Rio Vista residents as well as the Thornton residents to them potentially being a CCS site. Okay? In the previous discussion that Kurt made, we heard about risk assessment and how well-chosen sites could, for example, minimize the risk of any negative impacts on the community. But we also know from past work, and naturally enough, that communities are not all extremely well educated about CCS and its potential impacts, after all, so they have a lot of concerns. So these were the 3 that came up the most commonly. What if the gas leaks? What will happen? 2, could it contaminate our groundwater? 3, could the gas explode? And I guess this is, people were thinking about that incident similar to the Cameroon one or whatever. There was this worry, what if it just explodes? We had to explain, CO2 is actually not flammable. So all these concerns, however, actually echo past research on CCS, public perceptions of CCS, and we saw it too. But what did we find in addition that we think is actually interesting and worth bearing in mind, regardless of what your 2 motivations, which of the 2 motivations you have for being interested in public perceptions? There were some real differences in the communities, okay? And these differences were robust across the focus groups. Overwhelmingly, the Thornton residents, that is the actual CCS site, and the poorer place, remember, were very much more resistant to hosting a CCS site than were Rio Vista residents. And on analyzing our interview transcripts, we found there were 3 reasons that could explain, remember this is preliminary research only, why these differences exist that hadn't really been picked up in any of the previous CCS perception studies that we had come across from any country thus far. The first was straight and simple socioeconomic status. Why did that make a difference? Why did that make a difference? Because well-off people are better educated and understand that CCS poses a risk? No. That was not the reason we found for socioeconomic status making a difference. The primary reason was the poorer communities thought that having a large, possibly unattractive technology plumped into their backyard without consultation and participation of the community was yet another marker of their low standing. So the comments we got was, would you like it? How about up there in Berkeley? Why not up there in Berkeley? Seems like a good idea to me. Why us? The comment that came up again and again, again it's us? Why us? 2, their specific environmental histories were very important. Specific environmental history means what was their impression or what was their experience from having past environmental problems. Here in Rio Vista, we found they had had some environmental issues. You know, every community has some environmental issues after all. But they felt that they were people of some influence, people of some means, and people with some organizational capacity, and therefore, should there be an environmental problem, should CCS, for example, turn out to be a little more risky than we currently think it is, one more minute, then they had the option of redress, of doing something about it, of getting some compensation. In Thornton, nobody believed they would get compensation. They already knew their groundwater had been damaged. They gave us specific dates. This is when the water began to come out brown. These are all the steps the community took to actually redress it. Nothing's been done. People have to boil their water and buy Brita filters, and we're poor and we can't afford it. So if something happens, and if CCS isn't so hot, nobody will help us at the end of it. So what is their main risk? Their main risk perception is not actually the risk of CCS. Their main risk perception is trying to mitigate the downside risk of not having any redress should the damn thing turn out to be riskier than we say it is, which is a very different idea from what is the risk of CCS per se. And very much something that I think has not been taken into account in any surveys or in policy circles so far. I'll skip the last one in the interest of time. So our overall conclusion was that the lower socioeconomic status of Thornton, the very poor history of redressing past damages, and also, I wasn't able to discuss this in detail, less than positive history with the gas industry so far, has led to feelings of community disempowerment and a basic lack of trust that procedural justice will be observed. And those two things, the disempowerment feeling and the lack of trust in procedural justice, far outweighed their actual fears of technological and economic risk in their resistance, whereas the better off communities did not feel it. I'll close with just one thing. If the community feels the way Bullet 2 says, resignation that they could do nothing anyway, yeah? You won't have an uprising. Naturally. They resigned, they're poor, they're disorganized, they're marginalized already. You won't have an uprising. But it's not clear that you have democratic decision-making either. So what is this public acceptance and public education and outreach that we are seeking? I think it's important to ask ourselves that question in the light of the different definitions that that term actually has. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Dale Simbeck. Dale's the Vice President of Technology from SFA Pacific. He was one of the founding partners in 1980. His principal activities involve technical, economic, and market assessments of energy technologies for major international energy companies. This includes electrical power, heavy oil, emission controls, syngas production. He's also a leader in the one of the authors of the special report on carbon capture and storage, and he supervises students at Stanford in the PhD program. So, Dale.
Thank you very much. It's quite an honor to be here, and this is the first time I've ever given a talk at Berkeley, at a lot of other schools, but not here. And our president is a proud alumni of UC Berkeley, and he informed me that if I didn't give a good talk, I would be working weekends for the next month. So I'm going to give a very complex talk, a half-hour talk in 10 minutes. Now, this is a smart group. There'll be a lot of things I won't talk about in my discussion. I'll just hit upon the high points, but you'll have all these slides. The first thing is put things into perspective. There's only 4 options I hope you all know and how we can reduce CO2 mitigation. We have to focus, of course, on energy intensity and carbon intensity in the 2 big ugly gorillas, the United States and China. The United States at 20% of man-made emissions, but we tend to forget about it's also 20% of world GDP. China has actually just surpassed us, which is an incredible feat. They've risen so fast in their CO2 emissions. But before you start picking on developing countries, you better look in a mirror and see if you're an ugly American. And we are ugly Americans. We've gotten a lot uglier because of corn ethanol we're putting in that big gas-guzzling urban assault vehicle. And so just be aware, everyone hates Americans for good reason. We're ugly. Okay? The U.S. emissions are very similar to the world emissions in terms of the breakdown. And where the 2 big emissions are, which you've heard from everyone, is in transportation and power generation. Now, the U.S. Is somewhat unique in their power generation. Coal for electricity is 40% of the world as well as the United States, but where the U.S. is unique is we have very old coal plants. The average megawatt weighted age of those coal plants is over 35 years. From an efficiency standpoint, they're third world technology from efficiency, not traditional emissions. Are getting quite clean. But from a CO2 emission, the add-on retrofits keep driving down the efficiency. And so those are being life extended forever at this point because of what's referred to as cap and charade, not to be confused with cap and trade. Okay? And cap and charade means business as usual. You're going to have a 20% reduction in replacing these plants, but no one in their right mind would replace these until they're given some allocations. So they're going to be life extended until there's money to be had. A key thing in the work we've done, and most of our work's for the private sector, is power plants will have to meet a disproportionate amount of any CO2 reduction. We obviously should go after the big gas-guzzling urban assault vehicles, but those are sacred cows from a political position, and that is politicians will not put a big carbon tax on gasoline because they feel they can't get reelected. Now, we can't put a big carbon tax on all the industrial sectors because governments are very powerful, but one thing they can't make you do is stay in business and lose money. It's called bankruptcy. And so basically, the carbon-intensive industries would move to China, which would actually make the CO2 emissions much worse. But the power plants are very vulnerable. They can't move to China. That's their key Achilles heel. The third is we should pick on the coal-based power plants because of that age and the potentials are very large for reduction. First, reducing the coal use in terms of efficiency, conservation. Second is replacing coal with all these other low carbon emission options. But third, and that's what I've been asked to talk about, is CO2 capture and storage. And that's a win-win from 2 standpoints. The resource is so big in these coal plants, but if you ever get this infrastructure in place, high carbon taxes would drive waste biomass into those plants that could be used very effectively for double dipping, for double reductions in CO2. So I'm always amazed advocates of biomass tend to shun capture and storage, and that either shows they're naive or they have agendas and they don't really care about the issue. If we're ever going to do anything with CO2 reduction in the atmosphere, we need all these options, and I don't have time to talk about them. They're all important. All I'm going to talk about is that last option on capture and storage. In particular, it is both for fossil fuels and for waste biomass. Eventually, as the infrastructure is in place and the carbon taxes increase, you can afford to haul more to those plants. Once it's a solid fuel plant, biomass works very easily for blending in those plants. The overview on capture and storage from a technology perspective is very simple, and that is you want any carbonaceous fuel, that's fossil fuels or biomass, you utilize that and make a CO2 stream, and you want to capture and store that CO2 stream. But of course, the devil's in the details, and there's 3 big issues. First and foremost is location, location, location. And that is you need certain geology where you can do this. Parts of the world you can't, other parts of the world you can. The United States is lucky, as you heard with our first speaker. We have a lot of the geologic formations where this looks quite sound to do. The next is you need a very big point source for economies of scale, and that tends to drive you to large central power plants and those high in carbon, which would be the coal plants. Third, you want high concentrations, and then you have to compress that to very high pressures. Again, that tends to drive you to the coal plants, but also the compression to very high pressures for the storage, transportation, injection. The next speaker will talk about this, but just to summarize, it's very important to realize the U.S. is the world leader in CO2 capture and storage. It's been done for 25 years here. It's about 25 million tons a year. On this chart are the anthropogenic sources of CO2 that are being used as opposed to natural domes. So the structure is in place and it works very well. The next speaker will talk about that. The issue there is, of course, it's used in enhanced oil recovery, not just storage by itself, but it is stored. There's a lot of challenges, and I'm going to use the next few minutes to highlight these challenges. And in my mind, the biggest is the magnitude to really impact the CO2 in the atmosphere. You're talking big numbers. And so each year, our CO2 in the atmosphere is going up by 2 ppm. So let's assume 1/4 of this reduction is from capture and storage. That would be 1/2 ppm per year. From business as usual, that would be 4 gigatons or billion tons per year of CO2 captured and stored. So what that translates to is roughly replace 500 gigawatts of old coal plants, which, by the way, there are 500 megawatts of old coal plants worldwide that should be replaced. You could replace all those with nuclear. That would give you the reduction. You could replace them with capture and storage, and that would give you the reduction. And by the way, that works out to, once it's compressed, the volume is 80 million barrels per year. That's basically what the worldwide oil use is. So that puts the volumes into perspective. The other thing is if you blend 50% biomass into that, because of the double dip, you get this about a third reduction in what you have to do because of the double dip of waste biomass. Now, who needs this option are the coal companies and the coal-based utilities. The cost is the easy part. The hard part, as you heard in the last talk, is public acceptance. Another problem I see is that they need the expertise of the oil gas industry to get the geologic expertise to do it right. And there tends to be a they know not that they know not, which is frightening among the coal utilities, that they shun away from trying to work with some of these oil chemical companies that have that expertise that they need. Just for the storage side, they can do the capture side. The liabilities are overwhelming, especially for the United States. I think capture and storage in the United States with our current laws and mineral rights beyond EOR is absolutely hopeless. It's very simple, and that is with our tort system and mineral rights, every ambulance-chasing lawyer would become a CO2 injection-chasing lawyer. Okay? I mean, they would just flip-flop is all they would do, and they would win. They would win. I mean, I've been an expert witness in 6 litigations, one that went all the way to federal mini-court, and the U.S. system of law has very little to do with justice. The objectives to make lawyers and consultants rich. So, this is very dangerous to consider CO2 capture and storage in this country. I personally think it's hopeless beyond EOR until we change the laws and liabilities. The place to look is Canada, Australia, China, and Europe, where the government owns the mineral rights and the pore space and could do it right. The basics on the cost are very important, and there's 3 parts. The biggest part is getting it to a pure stream. That's about 50% of your cost, about 25% of the cost to compress it up to supercritical conditions, about 25% of the cost to transmit, inject, and store. Of those costs, the reason that they're so high is the increased capital and energy use. And the easiest way to do this is put it in gross terms, and that is if you had a new coal plant with and without CO2 capture, adding capture would drop that plant from about 400 megawatts to 3 and about 40 to 30% efficient. Those are gross rounded off terms. That's for a new plant with and without. The key is if you go into these old plants that are inefficient right now, you can actually avoid any capacity efficiency loss if you go out after the old plants, and that's where you really should go. So most of these costs are due to that. Also, it's important to look at the matrix of how to measure this. The best one is to look at the electric cost increase, but watch out for CO2 avoidance costs because that varies tremendously based on your baseline. But you do have to think about CO2 avoidance because that, in essence, is the minimum carbon tax where people would consider to do this. And so here's the formula for avoidance. It's very simple, but look at this B, baseline. The baseline is very important, and that is for an existing coal plant, that baseline is very low. Look at the baseline on the other side of the fraction. If it's a natural gas plant, that's very low. So the important thing here is CO2 avoidance costs for existing coal plants are very high, and for using natural gas as your baseline are very high because of the simple math there. So when you look at the question, I'm considering a new coal plant, what's the minimum coal tax or carbon tax that I would need to consider CO2 capture as opposed to just pay the tax? It's a minimum of at least $30 per metric ton of CO2, and it would increase those power costs from about 7 to 10 cents, and that's for a base load power plant, U.S. Gulf Coast in 2006 cost. Here in California, you'd have to add 25 to 30% to all those, plus update the year's dollars as well. For the base delivered cost of base load power, that's industrial type, not residential, you'd see an increase of about 3 cents on that electric price. For an existing paid-off plant, they literally would do nothing up to $60 per ton carbon tax. You can't beat the old coal plants to death with a carbon tax because their price of electricity is so low, they can afford a very high carbon tax. Because they're starting with 3-cent electricity. That's why they can afford such a high tax. So in their case, you need cap and trades, allocations, some type of taxing that discriminates against the old plants. And how you work that out, I'm not sure. But it has to be done. The economics are very clear that you have to address different ways for those old plants or they'll run forever because it's cheaper to pay the tax unless it gets very high. For natural gas, then you have to ask the other thing, well, if this $30 per ton, what's the natural gas price I can pay to avoid this capture and storage? Just use natural gas instead. And that's about $9 right now, but keep in mind in a carbon-constrained world, the only thing you know for sure is natural gas prices go way up. As natural gas prices go way up, capture with natural gas becomes way too expensive to consider. Briefly, I'm going to talk about the 3 options now on capture and storage. The first being pre-combustion. That's the most developed at this point. That's basically gasification of any carbonaceous fuel, including biomass, to this mixture of hydrogen CO at high pressures. You react the CO with water to a high-pressure stream of all just hydrogen CO2. That separation of CO2 is very easy because it's high pressure and high concentration. Commercially, this is done around the world. The most impressive plants are in China, where they have about 25 world-class ammonia plants with gasification, and they have captures to pure CO2 vents right now of 3,500 tons per day, commercially used. It's just vented, but it's pure dry CO2. Also, in oil refineries, there's about 500,000 hours of operation of gas turbines on hydrogen-rich gas. The issue there is they're mostly not the state-of-the-art high firing temperature turbines. With the state-of-the-art turbines, that gets a little trickier on hydrogen-rich gas. The attributes of this approach are the intermediate of a hydrogen stream or synthesis gas stream before you utilize the fuel. That gives you a lot more options than just steam with a boiler. Post-combustion, as the name applies, you look at any combustion, a standard combustion, and then look at a system to remove the CO2 out of the flue gas. But in that case, it's very low pressure, low concentration, there's oxygen present. And so it's very tough to do that recovery. Now, status of this for natural gas streams at high pressure, this is done very large scale commercially, but that's at high pressure, no CO2 present. Once you look at flue gas, the largest plant in the world is only 330 tons per day, and that's on natural gas. It's not even on coal. So this is a step down from the first. The attributes are the utilities tend to feel more comfortable with this than gasification. Only a chemical engineer can like gasification, and there generally aren't chemical engineers in power plants. And flue gas desulfurization is about the simplest process you can think of. And they're comfortable with this, but CO2 is a lot more complex than flue gas desulfurization. Also, this works very well on retrofits of any generic retrofit on flue gas. The issue, though, is the power and steam needs to do it.
We have about 1 minute.
Okay. Okay. Oxygen combustion is the least developed at this point, but it's probably the favored by the power industry because there's no chemical processing involved. The thing to remember here is it takes twice as much oxygen as with gasification. Advanced systems, there's a lot of advances. I don't have time to go through these, but here are the different things that are being developed. Getting to the summary, there's 25 years of commercial experience with CO2 capture and storage, which you'll hear in the next talk. Pre-combustion is the most developed. It has the advantage of hydrogen. The issue here is that it really has to be done in an integrated system in a utility setting for the power industry to accept that. And there's still a problem here, this lack of chemical process expertise in a traditional utility. Post-combustion is less developed, but it's relatively simple, and the utilities feel more comfortable with this because it's less complex and it's good for retrofits. Oxygen combustion is the least developed, but the risks are pretty minimal if you recycle a lot of flue gas, and this tends to match boilers rather well, and it's liked as well because there's no chemical processing at all. Capture and storage costs are mainly due to that increased capacity and lost efficiency. It's important that we really, the costs are known. The issue is acceptance by the public, and that's why they need these capture and storage demos as soon as possible. Conservation efficiency is always best, but we tend to ignore that. It doesn't have sex appeal, but that's always the best. The renewables, biomass are great, but realize there are certain limitations there I don't have time to go into. For big reductions, I think we probably do need this option on the table. There's a lot of potential there, and the reductions can be large, especially if we add in the biomass. But the challenges are great: location, liability, and cost, most of all, public acceptance. So thank you for your time.
Keep going, actually, is the best way. Let's see. Okay, thanks very much, Dale. The next speaker is Roger Williams. He's the Vice President of Portfolio Development at Blue Source. You'll hear about Blue Source here. His expertise is in environmental market design and implementation, and he has bachelor's degrees from Duke University and a master's degree from Yale.
Sorry, before Roger gets started, just a quick announcement on time. We're running a little late, so we were supposed to wrap up here at 11:30, and lunch doesn't start until 12:15. The poster session is between 11:30 and 12:15. So what we'll do is we'll go about 15 minutes long, give you enough time to still make it through the poster session, and then be at lunch at 12:15. So we'll go until 11:45, so Roger can have his 10 minutes, and we can have a good Q&A.
Thanks much. Thanks for that update. And I'll try to not clip things too short, but be conscious of the time. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially for me. I spent a semester here at Berkeley in '87 as an undergrad, and I haven't been back in a while, so I intentionally tried to come early and walk around and bring back all sorts of memories, and then I realized that I had to need to focus on my presentation and not get too distracted, but it's a special treat for me. In my presentation this morning, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Blue Source, and which I hope will be valuable in terms of providing some context. So who's active in this space and a profile of our company I think will be useful. And then from there, try to articulate our vision on the role of CCS in the United States, and then finally turn towards some of the risks and screening issues that we go through as we assess projects. And hopefully that will spur some good questions at the end. So quickly, an overview on our company, formed in 2001. Back in November, a year ago November, part of our company was bought by First Reserve, which is a leading private equity firm specializing in energy. With that partnership, we announced the formation of a $1 billion equity and debt investment to basically finance projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These are large CapEx projects, definitely including CCS, other projects as well, all forms of methane abatement. I'll get more into that later. We have two primary business segments to our company. The first is the greenhouse gas verified emission reduction portfolio, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it currently comprises 11 different project types. It's the largest of its kind in North America, and these are projects that across the board have reduced greenhouse gas emissions starting in 2001 through 2019. The second part of our business is the physical CO2 asset development group, which is then building the projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions that feed into our verified emission reduction portfolio. And I mentioned about the size of our portfolio. This is largely a function of having focused on the US when a lot of folks kind of like us. In terms of the carbon market, we're looking internationally at CDM opportunities. Approximately 300 million tons in the portfolio now. Pretty good geographic scope, sourced in 45 different states in the United States. And again, vintage years from 2000 to 2019. In all cases, any tons that we sell are listed on a public registry, and there's approximately 45 million tons currently on public registries in North America. And I mentioned the 11 different project types. Again, just a little more color on that. CCS, we're particularly strong in all forms of methane abatement, aggregated energy efficiency, and intermodal projects. We've done some innovative work with looking at shifting from truck to rail. We've been in the lead for certain types of projects. Geologic sequestration is one. Also, as I mentioned, transportation. That's largely with a partnership we have with JB Hunt Trucking Company. Also in logistics and some coal bed methane. So we've created this portfolio, but we haven't just been waiting for people to come and purchase, but we have been active in selling in the voluntary market. We see the compliance market coming, but today it's all around voluntary transactions, and so we focus on over-the-counter, business-to-business transactions with companies that, for example, have taken on a CSR commitment, taken on or positioning themselves around pre-compliance. And we've sold over 15 million tons in the voluntary market to date. I'll kind of move through this one pretty quickly. Again, our CO2 infrastructure group. We've developed, constructed, and/or operated as the management team for Blue Source 5 of the last 5 anthropogenic CO2 pipelines built in North America, and again, that's vent-stack CO2. The past experience, there's a list there of some of the projects, and I mentioned, and we have a lot under development in several states in the West and Midwest, and more recently also in Canada. Under the carbon credit creation and trading experience, we've sold and delivered approximately 10 million tons to the market for geologic sequestration projects. And then just on the scale of our sourcing, it's approximately 700 million metric cubic feet per day currently. So our focus is looking at the nexus, the intersection between energy security and climate change, and our vision of, we call the carbon highway. And essentially the idea there is that as we're looking at a carbon-constrained future, there's going to be a heavy amount of infrastructure that needs to be put in place, very expensive, but basically shifting an infrastructure that's going to be used to move CO2 into viable sequestration sites, acknowledging that the mitigation potential for CCS is a big bucket, and we have to address that and take advantage of that as a species, really. We've been achieving this by building CCS infrastructure on the back of oil industry when possible. And what that means is that all the projects that we've done to date, these are CCS projects that have an enhanced oil recovery component to them. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but essentially the idea is a lot of enhanced oil recovery that's taken place historically is looking at natural CO2 coming out of the ground, so pulling it out of the ground and re-injecting it into the ground. And from our perspective, even if it's more costly, we should look at then the anthropogenic source, the vent stack that's ideally close by, and instead of pulling the CO2 out and re-inject it, well, let's create the pipeline from that vent stack and then sequester that CO2, which is part of the additionality for what's normal for EOR and what we're doing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And over a number of years, we've been identifying and linking these sources and sinks. On the source side, you know, these are natural gas processing facilities, fertilizer plants, ethanol, and others. From our perspective, this also, one of the tangential benefits is increasing energy independence for the United States. And we've been active in working with government and public institutions on geologic sequestration opportunities. We're involved with all of the regional CCS groups, including Westcarb here in the western US. And all that's resulting in capturing a significant amount of CO2 that otherwise would be vented into the atmosphere. So what are some of the drivers here? Pretty quickly, we feel like this is the perfect storm, in a way, for single-point large industrial emissions of CO2. One, we're looking at the largest build-out of power generation in history is coming over the next 15 years. What will that look like? And that's, I think there's an acknowledgement that, and this is kind of, I think one of the best presentations I've seen recently is from David Hawkins over at NRDC, of saying, you know, if we could go straight to renewables, fantastic, and I personally believe that as well. But the reality on the political side and the pace at which we can get there is one where coal is going to be around. So let's be smart about what we do and how we construct those plants. Higher natural gas prices are driving lower purity natural gas, which are high in CO2. So that's another trend that's taking place right now. That's the CO2 we want to capture and sequester. And also, as Dale mentioned, the growth in ethanol-related fuel. And ethanol kicks off a lot of CO2. There's a lot of these plants that are being put in place right now. And right now, they're just venting into the atmosphere. So again, the perception of kind of clean ethanol, but it has kind of a dirty closet, if you will, that we're trying to address as well. The growth in ag is also spawning expanded fertilizer production. And again, that's another key area in terms of single-point source from fertilizer plants. A little bit more on this concept of the carbon highway, carbon infrastructure. There's currently about 3,500 miles of existing CO2 pipelines, again, built on the back of oil. These are enhanced oil recovery projects. What is that doing? It's laying the groundwork that hopefully then saline aquifer and just straight CCS for CCS sake can then piggyback on top of this infrastructure, make it more cost effective, because right now no one's doing it besides small pilot projects. We've done some estimates at $10 per ton. We think about 1,500 new miles of CO2 pipeline can be built, and $10 per ton, that's traded in the voluntary or compliance market. At $20 per ton, our estimate is around doubling the size of the existing network of pipeline. Again, paving the way for that infrastructure and make clean coal actually more cost effective and other types of CCS. And that's the point below. And another interesting, I think, point here is that U.S. sinks are within 200 miles of all major CO2 point sources. So if you really look at it, and our company spent a lot of time envisioning this map of connecting the dots here and trying to grab all that CO2 that's vent stack and sequester that in viable sites. And actually, a little side note, we did recently form a company called Blue Strategies focused on sink characterization, acknowledging that you have to get that right. And so we're working with various universities on that initiative. The coming power generation build out in CCS infrastructure kind of relates to the points above. Just a quick note on anthropogenic CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Is this business as usual? A lot of people come up with, ask that, say, you know, is that happening already? And just a couple of quick statistics there, that U.S. domestic production of oil is currently 4.95 million barrels per day. U.S. domestic production for oil from EOR is just 1/5 of that. So, you know, well, no, 0.21, so 4.2% of oil produced domestically is from EOR, so it's a pretty small number. And of that, the EOR oil that's sourced from anthropogenic, using anthropogenic CO2, is just 17.6%. So all told, U.S. domestic oil production from anthropogenic trapped captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery is about 0.75%. So this is not business as usual. This is definitely a bit of an anomaly. Despite that fact, as Dale mentioned, that with the few instances that are out there, there are some good data points of 30 years of experience, which I think also leads into some of the safety issues of kind of what's happened at those sites. Is it an anyway event, which for the carbon market is a big issue? And as I mentioned in the previous slide, EOR is not business as usual, and the proven technology is evolving steadily, including rolling baselines, advancements in the technology, advances in the separation and capture, which is also driving down costs. But currently, it is expensive. That's why there's not that much of it. The economics typically prevents anthropogenic CO2 based solely on the oil revenues. So here's the piece of why these projects aren't happening. And we see so many projects that we assess that just don't fall into, and I'll show a slide here of the sweet spot for us of one that's financially viable. And part of that is the lack of cost-effective anthropogenic supplies, the separation and capture technology, which will improve over time, and also the interruptibility of the sources, alternative business risks. So compared to natural domes, you're inheriting some added risks that for a lot of developers they just don't want to take on. Given that, there is some low-lying fruit, some exceptions to, that make sense, and this is the co-products that lower the cost, so natural gas, chemicals, refined products, and the proximity, what's the distance between the anthropogenic source and the sink. And then high crude prices have resulted in higher CO2 prices, so that's spurring along some of the development. Existing CO2 pipelines, Dale put up a very similar slide, so we can move on from that. I'll just layer on there the project development focus for our company. As I mentioned, states in primarily Midwest, West, and a little bit in Canada. That's increasing. From the screening side of things, no surprises here. We're utilizing a low-cost and reasonably accurate method of analysis, passively identifying high-potential anthropogenic vent stack-sourced enhanced oil recovery or geologic storage projects. We really are anxious to be one of the first saline aquifer injection be involved with one of the first saline aquifer injection projects. But again, the price points on that, it's a bit of a different animal. I mentioned this in that figure, well, in the middle, basically the sweet spot for us, and as we're looking at a project screening tool, is something that we've developed over the years. On the left-hand side, looking at supply-demand, so basically the distance from source to sink. And on the bottom axis, looking at CO2 demand in millions of barrels. And then the CO2 deliverability, so looking at then the million cubic feet per day. And so as projects that fall within then those parameters are ones that we would then pursue more heavily. So a slide here on the investment risks. One of the key issues, the return on project investment is dependent upon carbon credit revenues. So as we look at the carbon side of this, and what do we worry about? What keeps us up at night as we are developing these projects that have this component that's such a key piece? On the compliance market design, that's not set yet. Lieberman-Warner legislation is giving us some good indication of where things are going, but that's likely to change a lot before a final bill is passed on the federal level. So specific issues within that are project start date, project types, what's in, what's out, additionality, how that is framed, price cap issues, which had showed up in earlier bills, not necessarily so much in Lieberman-Warner, and also market size. Early action measures, this doesn't apply to CCS necessarily, but with AB 32 as an example, there are early action regulatory measures for landfill gas, which is essentially kind of taking landfill gas off the table as a participant in the carbon trading market. So it's a traditional kind of command and control regulatory response, which we think is not as cost efficient. Again, what will future regulations look like? And then pre-compliance fashion, which again, in the voluntary market now, people are hot on certain things. Maybe ethanol is an example where a year ago it was in a different place than it is now. Same with various project types in the carbon market. where people right now, they really love landfill gas, at least outside of California. Certain people love terrestrial sequestration with trees, but we'll see, will that always kind of stay in vogue? And so as we make investments over the long haul, the projects that'll yield reductions over a 20-year period, there's a risk there, and how the public will embrace that and reward those projects that go beyond business as usual. And then for CCS specific projects, again, reserve potential, depletion rates, and cost impact of depletion would be a couple of the key areas there. And with that, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so hopefully that stirred a couple ideas in your head, and thank you very much for your attention.
So request, if you're going to ask any questions, use the microphone, because this will be recorded.
Okay, how about this gentleman right here? Yeah. Stand up and use the microphone and just identify yourself and affiliation briefly.
My name is Joe Westerson. I'm a grad student at Stanford. I had a question for Dale. You were talking about the liability for CCS projects being more than they are, for example, the EOR carbon projects. I was wondering why that is.
Well, I think the other speaker can answer this better than me. Let me do quick and then go. On an EOR, all the mineral rights owners agree to do this on an aggregated basis, and if a few hold out more than 50%, or there's a percentage where you have to get the mineral rights owners to agree to do the project. Whereas if you went in with just CO2 capture and storage in a saline aquifer or any other geologic location, lawyers would literally run around and find the people who own the mineral rights and tell them that they've destroyed your mineral rights, even though they probably don't have any, they're worth anything. Okay.
So because that carbon spreads out over multiple landowners' areas?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I guess, yeah, I think that hits it on the head. There's, especially with the carbon market, and aspects of ownership is just a critical one, and in the case of CCS, that can be kind of fairly complicated.
About this, yeah, right here.
Hi, Tony Bernhardt. I'm a scientist with Environmental Entrepreneurs. My question is, if we just take the numbers that were presented here, there's about 80 years worth of storage capability for all of the CO2 produced in the United States. What are the consequences of that limitation?
Well, I think it would be overly optimistic to presume to be able to actually inject that much CO2. If you're just asking in general about consequences of the limitations of subsurface storage, which I guess I could extrapolate that to, it's, once again, facing the reality of the scale of this problem. And they're just enormous emissions, and it probably cannot be solved. It cannot be solved by this approach alone. It needs multiple different approaches.
There's also a peak in CO2 emissions out there that the IPCC does a very poor job on, because they predict them going up forever, which is literally impossible, because the oil peak is probably within 40 to 50 years, and the natural gas peak is probably 10 years after that, and coal can't make up the difference. So our analysis shows the CO2 peak out there, which IPCC just shows it goes up forever, and which is incorrect. So time is of the essence in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, because we do get a natural CO2 man-made peak out there in the future due to the resource base of fossil fuels.
I guess one bit I'd add to that is that you know, we see this as, in a large part, as a bridge that we're heading towards renewables, and that right now, how can we get there? How can we get there? That's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think that's part of the shift that's going to occur. And when you place a price on carbon, that's going to spur all sorts of innovation, stuff that we don't even know yet. And so that's part of the hope, I guess, and part of the message that I would try to bring to this is that, you know, this is an important piece, but that's in parallel with renewable development, absolutely, that ideally renewables then surpass over time.
Okay, next question up here.
Thank you. I'm John Shin from Chevron. My question's for Roger, and it concerns your ability to serve as debt on these big capture and storage projects right now. I presume you're pretty much limited to the value of credits in the voluntary market right now in order to serve these projects, and that that basically limits your technology choices. So you can't really do saline injection at this point. You can't do anything but pre-concentrated CO2 as well. Is that fair to say, or correct me if that's a wrong assumption?
Yeah, and with the slide that I put up on just looking at CO2 prices and anticipated prices, because there's, CO2 is not selling at $10 a ton right now. We project that. We have projects that we see that we would love to do if we felt responsible that we could get that price per ton. Right now it's not there. As we get a compliance program in place, a little bit more clarity, that pricing will probably shift upwards, and that's going to open up the door to a lot of projects right now that are, waiting in the wings. That could happen, but we are a commercial entity. This isn't altruism, and so either that's subsidized with help from the government, or that price point is increased so we're able to do more of this and do it responsibly.
Yes.
I'm Amber Wise. I'm a graduate student in chemistry, and as a scientist sort of looking to get into policy, there's this huge communication gap, which I think you've done some work in addressing on public perception of all of these things. I really didn't know much about carbon sequestration until this panel, and is there anybody sort of working on educating the public on any of this, or is this all just going to be sort of in the ivory tower of academia and government, and the public will be sort of powerless to do anything about it?
I can take a crack at that. I imagine Isha will have some comments as well. But I know that is, Isha's presentation was great because it is hitting that on the head, that a lot of people do not understand this technology at all. There's such a need for education around it, what it is and what it isn't. And I think through the regional partnerships, I know they're trying to step up right now on some of the advocacy in terms of getting the message out and education around this. I know that NRDC and Environmental Defense are also starting to do a lot more of that. Just last month, there were a couple presentations, one in Sacramento and one in LA, that NRDC and Environmental Defense jointly put on for policymakers and others. And you should Google that, because the presentations are online and they're fantastic. They're with prominent academics, or probably colleagues of the folks on the panel here, and talking through issues of safety, all aspects of risk, cost, the technology, and I know the site that hosted it was called like Eventbrite, EVENTBRITE. So, but if you Google NRDC CCS, I'm sure it'll pop up, and I think they're trying to ramp up on that. So.
Okay, so let me just make three comments in response to your question. One, I don't think that there's an enormous public outreach and education effort going on right now. Not yet, anyway. We've had another part of this research involved quite intensive discussions with several NGOs, all of whom had actually different perceptions on the viability and usefulness of CCS. But even the fairly pro ones, like NRDC and Pew and so on, were actually concentrating their education and lobbying, I shouldn't say lobbying, education and advocacy efforts more on policymakers who are actually not exactly the public, okay, after all. But that was where they were headed. So it was a more indirect route. That's my impression. The second thing I would like to say is that what the public effort in education should be focused on needs to be understood. There is no public. There are many publics because the specific histories of different locations which are likely to be chosen as CCS sites are actually different. If you catch people in San Francisco airport and ask them, hey, what do you think about CCS and so on, and this is how it's going to help us, I mean, they have no stake in the matter. They might say, yeah, it's a great idea or not or whatever. Okay? But the people who actually have stakes in the matter are those who are hanging around near the areas which are likely to be chosen, and it's their perceptions that are the most critical, in some sense, for acceptance or resistance. And the third point I want to make is, I don't think we fully understood where some of those underlying fears come from. We focused whatever our public education and outreach effort is on allaying the public's fears about the risk of the technology. But what our preliminary findings are showing is that's not the only fear the public actually has. And we need to understand that to do an effective job if CCS is the way we'll eventually go.
Okay, we have time for one final question.
How about one of the first people who raised his hand? Yeah. Oh.
My question's quick, so. My name is R.M. Yang. I'm a chemistry graduate student here, and my question is for anyone really, but specifically Dr. Oldenburg. And Isha mentioned some of the cons, but could you maybe talk about some of the cons, and especially the leak rate or the time scale on which carbon sequestration would last?
So this is just on risks. I would put it more widely of geologic carbon sequestration. The issue, I think, that's probably the biggest concern at this point is the fluids that you're displacing with the CO2. And that is the CO2 itself is going into a volume that already contains typically very salty water. I think that the migration of the CO2 is very unlikely through the geologic system. If there are wells present in the area, those may need to be looked at for CO2 migration directly. But there is this large volume of salty water, and it's possible that at distances quite large from the CO2 itself, it could be displaced upwards and eventually impact an underground source of drinking water. I don't see any large-scale emissions of CO2 from these sites. If something like that were to happen, it would be observable and it could be mitigated. It could be dealt with. So I think it's more subtle, long-term, large-scale brine migrations. But even those, I do not think are a very significant risk. In other words, the risk of doing nothing today is larger than those.
There's an important database that's usually overlooked. We tend to talk about the CO2 in geologic formations for enhanced oil recovery. Those are kind of the easy ones. The hard ones, which are significant, I think, is in Canada. They've done a lot of acid gas direct injection in saline aquifers and deep wells with a lot of H2S. Well, you know, a few parts per million of H2S gets to the surface. That's a great canary, and it hasn't happened. So I would suggest look at the Canadian work on acid gas in deep well injection, which is more in line of your concerns. And I agree that the probabilities, if done right, tend to be relatively low based on the history.
I'd like to extend one final thank you to the panelists.